A young woman from Alaska, age 18, vanished from the coffee shop where she worked. Strange messages started to come in from her phone, but neither the police nor the FBI could find any leads. They did succeed in discovering the truth after a thorough investigation, but none of them could have predicted that they were dealing with one of the most horrifying crimes in recorded history. Welcome to A to Z Crime Stories. Before we start, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more. Alaska's Anchorage was the place of Samantha Koenig's birth on August 30th, 1993. The state's largest city is distinguished by a measured, quiet way of life, a harsh environment, and a huge expanses bordered by snow-capped mountains. The girl was very interested in animals and had plans to work with them after school. She also had the option of becoming a doctor. Samantha even entertained the idea of filling out an application to join the Navy as a nurse. In the beginning of 2012, she had part-time jobs at a Subway and a Harley-Davidson shop. When she was 18, she obtained a second part-time position at a downtown small-chain coffee shop. As for Samantha, she was thrilled about the chance. First of all, the task was not too difficult. She had to be by herself. Second, the entire operation of the business depended solely on her shift, but her boyfriend wasn't as excited about it. He tried to talk Samantha out of it because he was worried about her having to work through the night by herself, but in the end he agreed to it on the condition that he would pick her up after each shift. She reassured him that there were numerous cameras in the coffee shop and that there was a panic button for the police. Despite being in the middle of nowhere, the area around the coffee shop was relatively empty, much like Anchorage as a whole. Because of the low population density, empty streets can be seen even in the downtown area. Samantha had to put in a lot of work during the hours of darkness because Alaska's winters have a limited amount of daylight. Samantha quickly adapted to her new position and fell in love with it. She had already been employed there for a month by the beginning of February, and on the first day of the month, she was preparing to end her shift at 8 p.m. 5 minutes before the coffee shop closed, a regular customer arrived and placed an order for a large Americano. Samantha made the beverage and turned the window so the customer could receive it. As soon as he had the glass, he turned to face the girl and raised his gun. The lights in the coffee shop had to be turned off because a man in a ski mask announced that he was going to rob her. As soon as Samantha complied, the perpetrator smashed her hand through the window. The entire incident was captured on camera, but those unspoken bystanders were powerless to assist her. She also activated the panic button once she was inside the coffee shop due to her fear of the armed robber. Samantha was restrained and asked where her car was parked by the offender. The young lady said she didn't have one and added that her boyfriend would be picking her up in a few minutes. The man looked around, then took her outside and led her to his car. Samantha was able to escape and flee, but the attacker soon caught up to her and grabbed her. Sadly, no one could assist her at the time because nobody was on the street. The man threatened to pursue her if she attempted to flee once more. He led the girl across the street to his pickup truck and put her in the passenger seat, telling her he was going to kill her. Since the license plates had been removed, it is clear that the perpetrator had planned ahead as he drove the victim to an unidentified location. The man claimed that all he needed from Samantha's family was a ransom payment, and Samantha could then return home. He still did not reveal his face to her. He had been wearing a ski mask the entire time. The young lady pleaded with him to let her go and disclosed that her family was not wealthy, but the kidnapper was unreceptive. He once questioned Samantha about where her phone was. The perpetrator became incensed when the young woman replied that she had left it in a coffee shop. He returned to the coffee shop to get the phone because he needed it for his ransom scheme, and using it, he sent 2 messages to Samantha's boss and her boyfriend. The abductor wrote in them that the young woman was exhausted and would spend a few days with friends while Samantha was in captivity. The kidnapper texted, took the battery out of the phone, and got back in his pickup truck. The young woman was taken to an unspecified location that resembled a barn, where he instructed her to sit quietly. The man threatened to kill her if she tried to scream. He also mentioned that he had a police scanner and would be immediately alerted if she managed to call for assistance. Samantha's credit card was demanded, but things were not as straightforward as they seemed. The girl claimed to have a joint bank account. The man made the decision to steal the card because she was with her boyfriend and it was in his possession. He left Samantha alone and went to get the card after first learning the boyfriend's address and PIN number. He was told by the young woman that it was always in the man's car. Once there, the offender located the appropriate car and immediately began tormenting it. The man noticed it from the window at that precise moment and hurried outside, but it was too late. The kidnapper pulled out a card and bolted off quickly. He stopped at an ATM on the way back to go over the PIN code, then head back to Samantha's house. The young woman's family and boyfriend, meanwhile, were in a panic. Everyone knew that Samantha had suffered a terrible loss, but at the time no one made the connection between the credit card theft and the young woman's disappearance. The guy didn't even think that Nightfall could have any connection at all between the two incidents. The police were contacted by Samantha's family, and they started looking for. They looked at the coffee shop's security footage as soon as they could, and they saw her being kidnapped right away. The FBI became involved shortly after, but they turned up no solid leads. No information that could be used to identify the kidnapper was captured on camera, indicating that he had clearly planned out the kidnapping thoroughly. While Samantha was missing, the young woman's family raised the $41,000 they had pledged in exchange for information on her whereabouts with the assistance of concerned individuals. The parents were always there, being interviewed by regional TV stations and pleading for any information regarding the whereabouts of their daughter. Flyers featuring Samantha's image and details of the reward circulated throughout Anchorage, but as the days went by, the police never uncovered a single crucial witness. Desperate for information, the detectives checked on everyone Samantha knew, including her boyfriend and family members, but they soon found that none of them had any connection to the kidnapping. February 24th marked the end of almost a month. Samantha's partner was given a new message from her phone number stating that Albert's picture is under Connor Parkside. Isn't she adorable? As soon as they realized it was about the neighborhood dog park, Connors, the investigators, and the young woman's family went there. They eventually discovered where the kidnapper had gone. There was a booth in the park with various flyers, one of which featured a picture of a dead dog by the name of Albert. The detectives found a plastic bag under the flyer that the pet's owners had placed on the stand to bid their pet farewell. They discovered a Polaroid picture when they opened it, of Samantha with a newspaper from February 13, and the typewritten letter in which the kidnapper demanded that $30,000 be deposited into her bank account can be seen in the background. If these demands were not met, he threatened to murder the young woman. The FBI and the police came up with a strategy right away that would enable them to apprehend this considerate criminal. In order to force the kidnapper to frequent the ATMs, they instructed the father of the young woman to top up the card gradually, deposited $5,000, and a short while later, that cash was taken out of an ATM in Anchorage. Even though the kidnapper was caught on camera, the detectives were unable to apprehend him. The man had a hat, hooded glasses, and what looked like a fake mustache and beard. He couldn't have been identified based on the picture. When the police arrived at the ATM right away, the offender had already left. In Wilcox, Arizona, on the other end of the country, a week later, the thief withdrew additional funds. Despite traveling 6,000 miles to elude the investigators, they were still keeping an eye on him. The next cash withdrawal took place an hour away from Arizona, in Lordsburg, New Mexico. He then withdrew money from 2 more Texas cities, each in a different location. Police looked carefully at ATM images in the interim. They quickly came to the conclusion that the criminal had chosen Wilcox in a very bad way. The detectives now knew the make and model of his vehicle because he had parked it in the camera's field of view. Naturally, it was impossible to distinguish. They were able to use the license plates in the image instead of just the license plates before. All patrols were ordered to stop because authorities feared the kidnapper might cross into Mexico. A few days later, on March 13th, A Texas highway patrol saw a car of that make in a hotel parking lot. A man was occupying the driver's seat. The policeman made the choice to wait for him to arrive before following him. As soon as the driver went over the permitted speed limit, the man soon drove out of the parking lot and along the highway. The patrolman instructed him to stop at the curb 3 miles away. This was done to assuage the suspect's watchfulness. The patrolman pretended that this was a minor infraction, but if a dangerous criminal is behind the wheel, he may be armed and ready to fight back. Israel Keys, an Anchorage resident who is 34 years old, was identified as the driver of the white Ford. The police officer decided to search his car after being alerted and making a backup call. As a result, Samantha's mobile phone and her, along with a gun, a fake mustache, a fake beard, and dark glasses, they also discovered the boyfriend's bank card in the vehicle. The fact that Keys had never been brought to the police's attention, despite the fact that they had no doubts he was responsible for Samantha's abduction, still shocked them. The man lived with his girlfriend and daughter, age 10, ran a successful small construction business, and had a completely clean criminal record. Among his friends, he was regarded and trusted. Some employees of the Anchorage prosecutor's office even made use of him. The location of Samantha Gainey, who was being questioned, however, was a concern for everyone. Keys was remarkably composed. He laughed a lot and made jokes. The FBI agents continued their conversation in his manner, and eventually he admitted what he had done. He claimed he had been preparing to rob this coffee shop for a number of days. He had no idea if he would kidnap the employee in advance. He also established 2 rules that he broke. He was never supposed to look for victims close to his house and was never supposed to transport them in his car. He hesitated because of this as he stood in front of Samantha in a dim coffee shop, but on the night of the kidnapping, he decided to carry out his plan to the very end. Shed in the backyard of his home, where his daughter and girlfriend were at the time, was where he took her. In case his victim tried to scream, the perpetrator turned on the radio. He then walked away and came back with the bank card. Israel entered the house quietly, taking care not to wake up his family. He went into the barn, poured himself a drink, and then beat and killed Samantha. What about the picture they discovered in the park, though? Samantha appeared to be alive in the February 13th issue of the newspaper, which was published 2 weeks after the kidnapping, but in actuality, she had been dead the entire time, and the photo had not been altered. A detective who attended the interview claims that Keys fixed her eyelids so that her eyes were open and put on makeup. The murderer consented after hearing Israel describe the incident in such detail that it seemed as though he was listing the foods he had eaten for breakfast. Tell everything as long as the interrogation's confessional section is kept confidential. Only a few dozen yards from his daughter's bedroom, he killed Samantha because he did not want his daughter to hear everything. The morning after the murder, the detectives already believed Kia's tale was about to come to a close, but that was just the beginning. Israel and his family left the city of New Orleans for a sea cruise. Tickets had been reserved in advance, and the murderer was fully aware that he was carrying out this crime. As a result, he had to hide the body just hours before leaving, so that no one would find it. By leaving it in the same barn, Keys took the easy route. The body quickly froze because it was extremely cold outside. 2 weeks later, when Keys got home, he wrote a ransom note on a typewriter and took a photo with a newspaper. He cut the body into pieces after that and went to a small lake. He cut holes in the ice for the body parts bags and additional weights 40 minutes outside the acreage using a chainsaw. Having said that, Manick took up ice fishing. To recover those bags from the bottom, police divers had to work for 10 hours. Detectives also discovered that Keys used the same white Ford Focus rental car to travel between ATMs across different states. He once experienced a problem and went to one of the dealerships to get the car fixed. Unexpectedly, that woman was crucial in identifying the offender. Before the breakdown, the car was captured on an ATM camera, and all the police were searching for that specific make and model. Focus because at the time they lacked any other suitable vehicles. He would not have been stopped if the circumstances had been different. In the end, Keys admitted under questioning that Samantha was not his first victim, which the detectives had already surmised. The perpetrator had agreed to tell them about all the crimes he had committed in return for two demands. First, he wanted a death sentence that was guaranteed and demanded that it be executed within a year of being given. Second, he wanted everyone to remain in the dark about what he had said. The detectives were surprised by these circumstances, but they saw no reason to object as the maniac started to tell them terrifying tales. Israel started out as a criminal at a young age. He would trespass into people's homes, commit theft, start forest fires, and torture animals. Although they were ardent Christians, his parents followed a dubious and unwelcome branch of the faith. His parents frequently relocated across the nation due to their erratic religious preferences. Keyes enlisted in the army at the age of 20 and served for several years. He sexually assaulted an unidentified young woman in an Oregon park after seeing her there 3 years ago, just a few months earlier. Israel responded when questioned that he wanted to leave the army as soon as possible so he could begin killing. At age 23, he gave up, and that is when his killing streak started. We could go to the wooded areas where he's hidden weapons at any time and begin looking for victims. 2 such caches were discovered by police in New York and Anchorage. Money, weapons, knives, and equipment for body disposal were all present. In the years that followed, he frequently went out hunting and his victims were spread across numerous states, but the precise number is still unknown. Detectives believe Keyes committed at least 11 murders, and these are just the cases where numerous indications point to his involvement. The FBI has only been able to identify 5 of them. There may have been up to 30 murders in total. Israel had also been robbing banks, shops, and private residences, so they always had enough cash to travel and buy weapons. After questioning, his hiding places were found, and it was discovered that he had a sizable cash reserve. Despite all of this, the man has never been arrested, save for one instance during all of the interrogations when he denied any involvement, but the detectives did not accept his denial. Julie Harris, a 12-year-old girl, vanished on March 3, 1996. At the time, Israel Keyes, then 16 years old, resided in the after a witness discovered Julie near Keyes just before she vanished. The same neighborhood police began to suspect him. The girl's remains were not discovered in the river until a year later, and Samantha's killer eluded capture during questioning after her death. Keyes denied being involved, but again investigators were hesitant to believe him because they lacked concrete evidence from their conversation with FBI agents. Israel acknowledged that he had been a lifelong student of serial killers and that his hero was the maniac and Ted Bundy aspired to be like him. He proudly recalled how he was able to lead 2 entirely different lives and expressed no remorse for his victims. He was a decent family man and businessman on the one hand, and an inhuman killer on the other. The fact that Keyes asked the detectives to keep the specifics of his crimes from his daughter was the only thing that suggested a feeling. Additionally, he claimed that his own daughter was the reason he had never killed a child or another person. They were all forced to admit that Israel was a very thoughtful man who had made only one error in his entire string of crimes, as they could not demonstrate otherwise. He was supposed to confess all of his crimes to the investigators, but that never happened. Keyes committed suicide in his cell 9 months after his arrest, despite the fact that FBI agents had questioned him for hundreds of hours up to that point, most of which he had withheld from them. Under the bed in his cell, 11 drawings of skulls were discovered. It's possible that each one of the drawings represented the victim. The image wasn't released until 2020. Israel Keyes is therefore one of the craziest, most violent maniacs. He was able to continue having a spotless reputation while committing a variety of offenses and always getting away with it. He might not have been caught if he hadn't left his car in the line of sight of the cameras. Investigators were certain that he would have kept killing if he had. Keyes admitted that killing was his life's work and that he intended to keep on killing until he was dead. A woman was found dead in her own apartment. From the outset, the investigation was filled with oddities. The most significant lead was a bite mark left on the victim by the assailant. The chilling truth remained hidden for over 2 decades. When it finally came to light, It stirred considerable shock and disapproval given its unexpected nature. Sherry Rasmussen was born on February 7, 1957, in the state of Washington. She grew up in a large and friendly family with 2 sisters, and loving later, they moved to the city of Tucson, Arizona, where Sherry attended the local school. She was an excellent student and even finished elementary school a year ahead of her peers. Sherry completed the entire 7th grade program on summer vacation by herself. After graduating from high school in 1973, she enrolled in a California college where her older sister was already studying. In her first year, Sherry decided to pursue a medical education and become a nurse, for which she had to take additional courses at another institution. After graduating from college in 1975, Sherry decided to get a master's degree at the University of California, Los Angeles, and also worked there as a nurse to pay for her education. After receiving her master's degree at the age of 23, her father bought her an apartment in the suburbs of Los Angeles, but Sherry did not want to live off her parents, so she wrote her father a check every month for the entire amount of the mortgage payments. She also got a job at a local hospital, heading the nursing department for caring for seriously ill people. In May 1984, when Sherry was 27 years old, she met a man named John Ruthin. They immediately hit it off, and the couple started dating. John had a good education, worked as a computer engineer, and was a very intelligent young man. A year later, the couple decided to get married, and after that, John moved in to share his apartment. The newlyweds spent their honeymoon in Jamaica, after which they returned home to celebrate Christmas with Sherry's family. It seemed that this couple was destined for a happy and carefree future. On February 24th of the following year, when John was getting ready for work as usual, Sherry complained of feeling unwell and decided to stay home. She asked John to call her in a few hours at around 7 a.m. John left for work, closer to 10 a.m. John tried to reach her by phone, but she didn't answer. Half an hour later, he tried again, but still got no answer, so he called her workplace to check if she had gone to work. But Sherry hadn't shown up at the hospital, and her sister also tried to reach her, but without success. John returned home from work at around 6 p.m. and immediately noticed something strange. The garage door was open, even though he had closed it in the morning, and Sherry's car was missing. Therefore, he first thought that she had gone somewhere. As he approached the garage, he saw a lot of broken glass and immediately discovered its source. There was a small balcony above the garage with a glass door that had been smashed. He entered the house through the garage and, to his horror, found Sherry there. Was lying on the floor, her body badly disfigured. John immediately called the police, and detectives began to examine the crime scene. In all the rooms, there was complete chaos. Broken vases overturned furniture and scattered items. A bloody handprint was found on the wall next to the alarm button. Apparently, the victim tried to reach it but failed in addition to extensive bruises and wounds. Experts noticed a human bite mark on Sherry's wrist. Apart from all of the above, the marks on her hands indicated that the attacker tied up the victim. Before untying her, the cause of death was 3 close-range gunshot wounds. Detectives found a blanket with bullet holes in the apartment and concluded that the attacker wrapped the gun in it to muffle the sound of the shots. Detectives immediately concluded that there was a prolonged struggle between the attacker and Sherry. This was evidenced by the amount of scattered and broken items throughout the apartment, as well as a bloody mark next to the alarm button. The lead investigator quickly concluded that they were dealing with a failed robbery. According to his opinion, at least 2 criminals broke into Sherry's apartment, but they didn't expect her to be home. A struggle ensued between them, and Sherry fought for her life until the end. Several facts supported the robbery version. First, Sherry's car disappeared from the garage. Second, someone had placed the stereo equipment and player next to the staircase leading to the second floor. According to the police, the robbers wanted to take them and leave, but after the scuffle and murder, they fled the scene. However, there were some dubious moments in this version. First, the police did not find any signs of forced entry, which meant that either Sherry let the criminals in herself or they had a key. Second, The perpetrators did not touch absolutely all the valuable items, including the jewelry box standing in plain sight. Detectives interviewed all of Sherry's neighbors, but it didn't yield any new leads. Some residents heard the sounds of a struggle but not gunshots. They also didn't see anyone entering the woman's apartment. Experts took blood samples and fingerprints from the house, but they couldn't conduct DNA analysis. In 1985, the lead investigator also took a piece of cotton and soaked it in the trace of the bite on Sherry's body. He hoped that the attacker's saliva could be left behind, and eventually, experts could use this clue to catch the killer. After a thorough search of the apartment, detectives learned one interesting fact. It turned out that the criminals took only one thing: Sherry and John's marriage certificate. Strange, and also raised suspicions about the man himself, but his alibi was unquestionable. John was at work until the evening, and he simply couldn't have committed this crime. He also told the police about the disappearance of this document. Detectives were unable to find an explanation for this strange fact. After a week and a half, they found Sherry's car in a parking lot 4 kilometers from her apartment. It was unlocked, and the keys were in the ignition. Forensic experts tried to find fingerprints, but they were unsuccessful. Either the criminals only touched it with gloves on, or they wiped away all the fingerprints. 2 months after the murder that took place just a few hundred meters from Sherry's home, a robbery occurred. Detectives immediately found many similarities. 2 criminals broke into a stranger's apartment through the garage, threatened the owner with a gun, and stole stereo equipment. The lead investigator immediately thought that these 2 were behind the woman's murder, so the police tried to find them from witness accounts, created approximate composite sketches of the suspects, and also learned that both men were Latino, but they were never found. However, investigators did not show much interest in getting to the truth, which constantly irritated Sherry's parents. Her father regularly went to the police station, inquired about the progress of the investigation, and asked the detectives to consider different versions. He even asked them to take a closer look at John's ex-girlfriend Stephanie Lazarus, who was a police officer herself. Sharia told her father several times that she was obsessed with John, but the investigators only laughed at this version. They told him to watch fewer detective shows. The thing was, as Stephanie couldn't accept John's departure and learned that he was going to marry another woman, she came to Sherry's workplace. Stephanie told her that their marriage was doomed and that she and John would be together again sooner or later. In addition, she said that John had already slept with her after becoming engaged to Sherry, of course. After this visit, Sherry was deeply upset. Upon returning home, she told John what had happened, and he admitted that he had indeed slept with Stephanie. After she found out about his engagement, the young woman begged him to come over, spoke of her love, and urged him to return to her. But he said he loved Sherry and intended to marry her. Stephanie offered to sleep with him one last time, and John agreed. He apologized to Sherry and said it was a huge mistake on his part. The woman forgave him, and this incident with Stephanie gradually faded away. But the story didn't end there. Stephanie came to their home several times without warning under various pretexts. One time, she came with a set of skis and announced that John had promised to wax them for her the next time she entered their apartment when the man was not at home. Sherry did not even hear how she entered the room and was shocked to see Stephanie in her living room. When asked what she was doing there, the woman said she came to talk to John. Sherry had a hard time convincing her to leave later. She even thought of going to the police about this incident, but they did not. The woman was afraid that if she told them about the harassment by their own employee, they would just laugh at her. She also wondered how Stephanie managed to enter the residential complex. He was surrounded by a high fence, and a special pass was required to enter. Apparently, the woman used her police badge and the security letter, and as for Stephanie's apartment, there had to be a duplicate key. Otherwise, she simply could not have entered without breaking the log. Notice that someone was following her once she and John were sitting in a restaurant, and the woman saw someone staring at them intently. As soon as she looked at this person, he immediately left. Sherry did not see his face because it was covered with a hood. Unknown calls also regularly came to their home phone, and Sherry suspected it could be Stephanie. The victim's father told detectives about all these incidents, but they did not attach any importance to his words. They were sure that the murder was committed by the two. 3 months after the murder, something interesting happened. Some documents from Sherry's case disappeared from the police station. Among them were records of detectives about the progress of the investigation. They had to record almost every step related to the investigation of this crime, but at one point, the police simply could not find these journals. However, there were no important leads there anyway. Since then, the case has been hanging for years, and detectives did not show much. Desire to look for new leads. Despite constant pressure from Sherry's parents, 8 months after the murder, Sherry's father offered a reward of $10,000 for any information that would help find the perpetrator. A year later, he held a press conference where he again promised a reward for information, but in both cases, it yielded no results. 7 years later, the lead investigator on the case retired, and the victim's father decided to meet with his successor, hoping that he would take his job more seriously. Seriously? Additionally, it was 1993, and DNA analysis technology was already being actively used by the police to solve crimes. Sherry's father asked the detective to perform such an analysis and even offered to fully pay for it. However, the detective stated that it was pointless since they did not have a single suspect with whom to compare the obtained DNA profile. Meanwhile, John started a new family, but at some point he reunited with Stephanie. They planned to go to Hawaii together, but something unusual happened before that. The man called the detective and asked if they had any new evidence indicating Stephanie's involvement in the murder. Apparently, he himself suspected that the woman might have done something like that. But all these years, he was afraid to talk about it, although this did not prevent him from sleeping with her again. As for Stephanie herself, she was quickly climbing the career ladder in the police department. She received higher ranks twice, became Detective of the Year, and had an impeccable reputation. She also married another police officer, but this did not prevent her from regularly sleeping with John. In 2001, a separate unit was formed in Los Angeles to work on unsolved murders. They were given Sherry's case along with thousands of similar cases, and the detectives began sorting through them gradually. They briefly studied each case, trying to understand which ones had the greatest chance of being solved. For example, murders without any clues were pushed to the end of the queue, and cases with DNA samples of possible suspects were marked as the most promising. Sherry's murder made it onto this list because among the evidence was a piece of content that could have contained the perpetrator's saliva. Left after a bite 2 years later, detectives picked up the case and sent all available evidence to the laboratory. Due to high demand, they had to wait almost 2 years for the results, until January 2005. Among the evidence were nail fragments and blood samples from the apartment. All of them contained only Sherry's DNA, and the forensic scientists only had to study the sample from the bite mark on her body. The problem was that they couldn't find the vial with this evidence for a whole day, until they finally discovered it by the wall of a large refrigerator. After studying the sample, experts found foreign DNA belonging to an unknown woman. This profile was immediately run through the FBI database, but it wasn't there. Detectives speculated that this woman could have committed the robbery with another criminal, or 2 female robbers could have broken into Sherry's apartment. The investigators still believed that the murder occurred during a robbery. Therefore, they didn't consider any other versions. After they failed to find any new leads in this direction, the case was put on hold. This continued until February 2009, when a new detective took up Sherry's case and began studying the materials left by other investigators. Seeing that DNA from another woman was found at the bite mark on the victim's body, he questioned the robbery version. Detectives considered that the motives for this crime could be completely different, so they decided to compile a list of all the women who could potentially be related to Sherry's murder. As a result, they managed to collect 5 names, among them Stephanie, the victim's colleague at work, and 3 other young women. The detectives initially doubted Stephanie's involvement considering her reputation and successful career in the police. For this reason, he first decided to check the other suspects. Together with other investigators, they fairly quickly concluded that 3 women from this list had no connection to Sherry's death. They lacked motives and had alibis. After that, they began to investigate the nurse who worked with Sherry. Files stated that they had rather tense relations, and the police secretly obtained a sample of her DNA from the trash she threw away. Experts extracted the profile and found that it didn't match the saliva found at the bite mark location. Thus, the detectives had only one suspect left, Stephanie. He and several colleagues agreed to keep this information secret until they could obtain solid evidence or disprove this theory. None of them wanted to accuse a police officer with an impeccable reputation of murder, and Stephanie could easily ruin their careers using her connections. They began secretly gathering information on her, trying to find any connection to the murder. Same building on the same floor as them. Because of this, the investigators had to take many precautions and not even mention her name in their notes. Soon, the detectives discovered the first interesting fact. During the years of the murder, Stephanie owned a .38 caliber revolver, the same type of gun that was used to shoot Sherry. They also learned that the victim had repeatedly complained about strange and even aggressive behavior from Stephanie. The fact that the police officer came to share his workplace in her uniform and said rude things to her seemed suspicious. Even more suspicion was added by the fact that Stephanie had broken into Sherry's gated community and even into her apartment several times. After analyzing the reports and photos from the crime scene, the detectives concluded that the possible robbery seemed staged. Nothing was taken from the apartment, not even the valuable items that were prominently displayed, but instead only a player and stereo were taken away. Moreover, the shooter had to be well versed in how the gun worked in extreme conditions. He was able to wrap the gun barrel with a blanket in such a way that the neighbors did not hear a single shot. It is unlikely that a low-level thief of players could possess such skills, but a trained and experienced police officer could. Another fact indicating Stephanie's involvement was a stolen marriage registration certificate found in her apartment. Why would some random burglars look for this document and take it with them, leaving a whole box of jewelry behind? For Stephanie, it could have had a significant symbolic value. Perhaps killing Sherry was not enough for her, or she had planned to break into her apartment only for this document, but the woman caught her in the act. In the end, the detective learned that 2 weeks after the murder, Stephanie came to the police station and filed a report of theft. According to this information, someone had broken into her car, which was left near the pier, and stolen several items, including a sports bag, clothes, videotapes, and a .38 caliber revolver. The gun seemed very suspicious. Detectives suspected that she intentionally got rid of the weapon, disguising it as a theft. Further, she filed a report at a different police station where nobody knew her, which seemed very strange since her colleagues would have taken the case with the utmost responsibility. As a result, the detectives decided to obtain a DNA sample from Stephanie. Several officers undercover followed her for a week, until they finally had the opportunity to get it on May 28, 2009. Stephanie and her stepdaughter stopped at a cafe for a snack. As soon as they left, the officers took the glass she drank from and sent it to the lab. The next day, the result was a full match. Despite the many factors pointing to Stephanie's involvement, the detectives were still shocked. It was hard for them to believe that a high-ranking and respected police officer was connected to the murder, but the DNA results were indisputable. However, at that moment, they did not have time for these thoughts, and investigators began developing a plan to arrest her. They wanted to do this in the middle of the police station, in front of hundreds of officers. Stephanie had extensive connections, and the detectives decided to lure her away from prying eyes. The chief of the Los Angeles Police Department was unofficially informed that one of his subordinates was suspected of the murder. The chief ordered the detectives not to approach Stephanie while she had her service or personal weapon with her. He also considered the idea of arresting her in her own home risky. Since she lived with her husband and stepdaughter, the detectives began to think about how to get the person who outranked them to surrender their weapon, and soon they had an excellent idea in the basement of the police department. There were holding cells designed for temporary detention of criminals, so anyone entering there had to surrender their weapon to lure her. There a legend was created. Stephanie had extensive experience working in the department that dealt with art thefts. Therefore, on June 5, 2009, 2 detectives with hidden microphones approached her and asked for help. They said they had arrested a suspect who may have some information about stolen paintings. The detectives admitted that they were not familiar with all the details and needed the help of an experienced professional. Stephanie agreed and went with them to the basement, where the suspect was supposed to be held. After the woman surrendered her weapon, they went to the interrogation room, but there was no suspect there. Instead, the detectives gradually and very carefully laid out the cards on the table, asking Stephanie questions about Sherry's murder. At first, they simply said that they needed to ask her a few questions about an old case related to her ex-boyfriend. Over the course of an hour, they smoothly led the dialogue to a discussion of the murder itself. But Stephanie said that she hardly remembered Sherry, as it was all a long time ago. Finally, the detectives announced that they had obtained the killer's DNA and asked Stephanie to provide her DNA sample for comparison. At that point, the woman immediately said that she was not going to give her DNA, refused to talk further without a lawyer, and decided to leave. The detectives let her go, but several policemen with handcuffs were waiting for Stephanie at the end of the corridor. 23 years after the murder, the woman was arrested. Considering Stephanie's vast police experience, all attempts to talk to her during interrogations led to no results. She knew the situation perfectly. There was DNA evidence against her found at the bite mark on the victim's body, and it was extremely difficult to dispute this evidence, her involvement, and insisted on her innocence. As a result, the detectives had no choice but to prepare documents for the transfer to court over the next few years. Stephanie was held in a woman's prison until the first hearings began in 2012. It took the police 3 years to basically rebuild the case from scratch because their predecessors blindly believed in a failed robbery. It was necessary to redo all the materials and focus specifically on Stephanie. At the trial, the woman continued to insist on her innocence. Her lawyer questioned the DNA test results and also pointed out that there were no suspicions against Stephanie during the initial investigation, but all these arguments turned out to be completely unconvincing. The prosecution believed that on that day, Stephanie waited for John to leave for work and entered Sherry's apartment. She went upstairs and shot Sherry once, but Sherry managed to resist, and a struggle ensued that moved downstairs. Ultimately, Stephanie killed her and staged a riot in the apartment, creating the illusion of a burglary. She then found a marriage certificate and left the scene after her arrest. Detectives discovered that Stephanie had boasted to colleagues about her lock-picking set, and they found several books on how to pick locks in her home. This could explain how she entered the apartment without leaving any traces of a break-in. A log of not the best quality can be picked with live picks so that no expert will notice any traces. The trial ended on March 8, 2012, and the jury found Stephanie guilty of murder. She received a sentence ranging from 27 years to life in prison, as well as an additional 2 years for using a service weapon. The judge deducted 1,000 days from her sentence, citing the time spent behind bars awaiting trial and her good behavior. Sherry's parents tried to sue the detectives who originally worked on the case, despite the fact that the victim's father had been telling them to look at Stephanie from the very beginning. They ignored his words. This raises a reasonable question. Were they deliberately covering up their colleague, or did they really not believe? In her involvement in the first case, it would have been a serious crime, and in the second case, it would have been simple negligence and ignoring significant facts. Unfortunately, the statute of limitations had expired in this case, and the court refused to prosecute these police officers. As for Stephanie, she filed an appeal immediately after the trial, but it was quickly rejected. She still denies her guilt while behind bars. At present, she's 62 years old and can file a petition for early release only in 2039. Sherry's ex-husband John lost interest. In investigating her murder almost immediately after it happened, he started a new family, slept with Stephanie for a while, and later moved to another city. Detectives questioned his involvement, but this version seems unlikely. Most likely, he did not know about his ex-wife's plans, thus this case could have been gathering dust in archives to this day if it hadn't fallen into the hands of professional detectives. Everyone who worked on it before refused to even consider the version of their colleague's involvement.
A young lady was discovered inside her own apartment. Police launched an investigation but came up empty-handed. It took 40 years for a breakthrough to be made in the case, but in addition to the truth, the detectives also learned new, alarming information. On March 30, 1960, Robin Brooks was born in Virginia. She relocated with her family to the sleepy New York town of Highland when she was a young girl. Robin was a happy and outgoing person who always managed to make friends and find common ground with others. Mariah, her older sister, was someone she was very close to. Robin decided to relocate to California after graduation. The young woman had another compelling reason to relocate in addition to the state's climate. Shortly before that, her sister had also moved there, and Robin had made the decision to join her. The young lady obtained employment in Sacramento and rented an apartment there. A few months later, she got the chance to relocate to the apartment building where her sister and her boyfriend were housed. The apartments were vastly superior. So that Robin could spend more time with Mariah, Robin decided to relocate just before turning 20. The young woman had to work 2 jobs in order to pay the rent on her separate apartment, one of which was a cashier position at a donut shop just a few meters away from her apartment building. Robin decided to combine it with her second job by working the evening shift. The young woman made a lot of friends during her time living in this complex, which lasted about 1.5 months. She was happy to be able to see her sister again at work and other times as well. At the donut shop on April 24, 1980, Robin was scheduled to begin her shift at 4 p.m., but to the surprise of her co-workers, she never arrived. She never missed her shifts while she was employed there, and she frequently arrived even earlier than expected, so this was very odd. After waiting for several hours, one of the workers made the decision to visit Robin's apartment. Only one person answered the door when the co-worker knocked on it. Observation and reaction: he returned this door and informed them that the young woman was not responding after making several unsuccessful attempts. Because of this, Robin's co-workers were very worried because they believed that if something had happened to her, she would have called to explain why she couldn't come to work. She had made friends with every employee in the brief time she had worked there, and they were all genuinely concerned about her. They thought about contacting the police, but quickly realized that they wouldn't look for. One of them came up with an unconventional solution after Robin missed a shift at work. He offered to open the door to her apartment and see how she was doing. He and his co-workers went to her house, remained at the door for a while, and then made the decision to break in. When they were successful, they witnessed a startling scene. In the living room, where Robin was lying on her water bed, blood was all over the place. As soon as her co-workers called the police, officers arrived. Confirmed the young lady's demise. She appeared to have suffered numerous stab wounds from an unidentified attacker who attacked her with a knife and repeatedly pierced the water mattress, causing its contents to spill onto the floor. Police determined after investigating the crime scene that there were no indications of a break-in before Robin's co-workers opened the entrance door. They assumed that the killer entered the apartment through a window because the back door was also locked from the inside. Soon, forensic specialists discovered proof of. According to this theory, medical examiners were able to establish the victim's sexual assault through the discovery of fingerprints on the windowsill and obtain the offender's biological material. Additionally, there are minute amounts of blood in the apartment that do not match Robin's blood type. Blood samples were sent to a lab after detectives determined that the attacker had cut himself during the attack. Unfortunately, they were unable to use this evidence because DNA analysis was not available in the 1980s. Investigators started speaking with the victim's friends, starting with her co-workers, claimed that the young woman had finished her shift the day before at midnight and gone home. She was acting normally, laughing, and in a good mood. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. That particular day, Robin mentioned to her co-workers that she had washed her bedding before leaving for work and was unsure if it would dry in time for her return. Detectives deduced that the victim's apartment's bed wasn't made. Shortly after she got home, the murderer attacked her. Her sister also made a worrying report. Robin mentioned that she was being followed by a man a few days before she passed away. She didn't give any information that could be used to identify him, but she did say that he had frequented her store and acted in an odd way in an effort to win her favor. Robin did not take it seriously because he had not done anything to make her fear for her safety. Due to a lack of information, the police were unable to identify this individual. They talked to the victim's neighbors and continued their investigation without any leads. None of them had heard any screams or sounds of struggle that night. The victim was not being visited by anyone unfamiliar, according to the neighbors. Investigators also discovered that Robin did not go straight home from work that evening. Rather, she spent some time at a party with her friends before laughing. Her friends reported that she went home alone, and that there were no disputes or unusual circumstances at the party. After speaking with everyone present, the police came to the conclusion that they were most likely not responsible for her murder. The investigators ultimately came to a standstill because they had no viable suspects. There were no people from Robin's past who might have had ill intentions toward her, and she got along well with her neighbors and co-workers. They were unable to identify the killer at the time using blood or biological evidence, and fingerprint matching against databases did not produce any results. Authorities thought that the murderer, he was the regular customer that Robin had mentioned. The victim was allegedly followed from her place of employment to her residence, where he allegedly learned her precise address. The following day, while she was waiting at the store, he broke into her apartment through a window. He attacked her, brutalized her, killed her, and then fled when Robin arrived home. The investigation went on for a while despite the complete lack of evidence before it eventually came to a standstill. 24 years after the murder, the investigation wasn't reopened by authorities until 2004. Detectives hoped that the widespread use of DNA analysis at the time would enable them to catch the murderer. They sent biological samples and blood to a lab, where specialists extracted a DNA profile and entered it into the FBI database. However, no matches were discovered. This indicated that the murderer had not previously been convicted of a serious offense or that it occurred before such offenders were required to submit to DNA collection. Despite this, the California State Database held a concerning discovery for the investigators: the DNA. The murderer's profile matched one committed 3 weeks prior to Robin's death. A different young woman was assaulted at that time in her home by an unidentified man who then left the victim alive. The incident took place at night, so the victim was unable to see the attacker's face. She dialed 911 right away, and forensic specialists were able to take the man's biological material. Detectives searched for fresh leads in this case to finally pin down Robin's killer, but they were all unsuccessful. Investigators were left periodically checking the DNA profile against databases in case the murderer was taken into custody, but they were fruitless, and eventually the case went cold once more. His DNA was added to that view. Until 2017, when detectives learned about a novel technique called DNA phenotyping, this continued. In essence, geneticists examine a DNA sample and, using their interpretation of the results, sketch a rough portrait of the suspect. This approach is not exact and is more of an additional police guideline. Investigators can closely examine similar suspects or cross someone off the list with the aid of such a portrait. Detectives contacted Paraben Nano Labs, which carried out such research, and soon they had a rough sketch of the murderer. He turned out to be a man of African descent, but among all the individuals who even remotely resembled him, investigators were unable to identify anyone similar. 2 portraits were created by Paraben Nano Labs, one depicting the suspect's potential appearance in 1980 and the other in 2016. Both pictures were released to the media in an effort to generate more leads. The family of Robin made the decision to offer a $10,000 reward for any information about this person that could lead to his discovery in the hopes of finally learning the truth. Numerous tips were given to the police, but they all proved fruitless. They were still unable to determine who the actual criminal was. However, the detectives and Robin's family weren't going to give up. This murder case was added to the list of unsolved slayings in 2020. By then, funding had been allocated, and a fresh DNA analysis tool was in use, making it possible to identify even distant relatives of the DNA sample owner. For this, at least one relative of his had to be listed in national or local DNA databases. The Paramount Nanolabs experts received the Robin killer sample and waited. It took them several months to research every potential ancestor of the criminal, track down their family trees, and then identify a suitable suspect. As a result, the investigators at last received a name. Philip Wilson, 71, was suspected of being guilty, but the research findings did not support this. To compare his DNA to the sample discovered in the victim's apartment, the police needed to take it. They discovered this man's address and started keeping an eye on him. Given that a person is not required by law to provide a DNA sample, the police must use some deception. They frequently try to obtain something the suspect has had contact with. An example of this would be a water bottle or cigarette butt. Investigators also took the same actions in Wilson's case. They obtained something containing his DNA and sent it to the lab, where scientists discovered a perfect match. They identified the suspected murderer 4 decades later, and on February 24 of that year, he was taken into custody. Although the man claimed he had nothing to do with the murder, the evidence was against him. His fingerprints were also taken by the police because they coincided with those on the victim's windowsill. The investigators examined his biography. I discovered a lot of fascinating information around the time Robin was killed. The 31-year-old man resided a short distance from her complex. In addition, Wilson frequently stopped by the victim's place of employment, a donut shop. The police's initial theory that the murderer was the same enigmatic stalker who had bothered the young woman at work was supported by this information. The lack of the man's DNA and fingerprints in the databases was explained by the fact that he had no significant criminal history. Following his arrest, the trial's preparations got underway, but they took a long time. Years passed before the process started, and it wasn't until 2022 that Wilson and his attorneys prepared a new defense theory, according to which Philip and Robin had a consensual relationship that night. After the man went home, someone else broke into the girl's apartment and killed her. Regarding the suspect's blood that was discovered at the crime scene, Wilson's attorney insisted that he had been hurt at work and that it had become infected while he was at Robin's house. The prosecution gave this version some thought. Absurdity of events. First of all, the victim was not involved in a romantic relationship with anyone. Additionally, Wilson was most likely the strange man the victim complained about stalking her at work. There was no understanding between them, and the young woman found his actions and persistence to be infuriating. It would be strange to assume that Wilson left his biological material, blood, and fingerprint while the murderer left nothing at all, given that no other men's DNA traces were discovered in the victim's apartment. Furthermore, if we accept the suspect's lawyer, she had not made the bed, which was empty of bedding, prior to reaching out to him of her own free will. Wilson's defense also made an effort to implicate Maria's ex-boyfriend, who she was living with at the time, as a potential murderer. The man was not alive at the time of the trial, but the attorney attempted to persuade the jury otherwise by claiming that he was hostile, threatened Robin and her sister, and also broke into the victim's apartment, but nothing could be proven. Confirmed, so none of these claims significantly affected the legal system. Philip Wilson was consequently found guilty of murder. On his birthday, his sentence was revealed. The man was given a life sentence with no chance of release. He currently has a lot of health issues, so his time in jail won't likely be very long. The family of the victim thanked the detectives for concluding the investigation. Her sister acknowledged that she does indeed still feel guilty. Robin followed her to California. The man received no additional punishment for that crime because the statute of limitations had already passed. Detectives continue to ponder whether Wilson had any additional victims. Typically, criminals who carry out such heinous acts and wait a few weeks before stopping don't stop and keep hurting people. Wilson might not have intended to kill Robin, he may have just broken into her apartment and assaulted her, but she was able to see and recognize him because he had previously visited her store. The man may have chosen to murder and then refrain from committing other crimes out of repeated fear of a prison sentence. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like it. Thanks for watching.